The cantina on Nexus 7 was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions. Smoke drifted through dim blue light, and the air smelled like cheap alcohol and alien sweat. Most of the customers kept to themselves, nursing their drinks. And their secrets. In the darkest corner of the room sat Commander Zekthara. His blue-scaled skin looked gray under the weak lights. Where his left arm should have been, metal and wires moved with quiet clicks. His left eye was gone too, replaced by a glowing red sensor that never blinked. The burns on his face told a story he never wanted to share. They were the kind of scars that came from human plasma weapons. 3 years had passed since the war ended, but the marks remained. So did the nightmares. Zekthara lifted his glass with his remaining hand. The synthetic alcohol burned his throat, but not enough to wash away the memories. Around him, other aliens talked and laughed. None of them knew what he had seen. None of them understood why the proud Vorthan Empire had surrendered to a species that had barely learned to travel between stars. A young Vorthan female approached his table. She had the smooth blue skin of someone who had never seen battle. Her clothes were clean and new. A recording device hung from her belt, marking her as a journalist. "Commander Zekthara?" she asked. Her voice was soft, respectful. "My name is Caravel. I work for the Galactic News Network." Zekthara did not look up from his drink. "Go away, girl." Caravel did not move. She pulled out a chair and sat down, without invitation. "I want to write a story about the Human-Vorthan War. The public deserves to know what really happened." "The public knows enough." Zekthara's voice was rough like broken glass. "We fought, we lost, end of story." "But that's just it," Caravel said, leaning forward. "Most people still don't understand how we lost. The humans had maybe 50 ships. When the war started, we had thousands. Their technology was centuries behind ours. By every measure, we should have won easily." Zekthara finally looked at her. His organic eye was brown and tired. His cybernetic eye glowed red in the darkness. "You think this is some great mystery? You think there's some secret weapon the military is hiding?" "Isn't there?" Caravel activated her recording device. "The official reports don't make sense. They talk about tactical retreats and strategic repositioning. They don't explain why." Admiral Vextar's entire fleet disappeared near Teranova. They don't mention why our soldiers started calling humans Ghostmakers. The name hit Zekthara like a physical blow. His hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles went white. For a moment, Caravel thought he might throw the drink at her. Instead, he laughed. It was not a happy sound. "Ghostmakers. You know where that name comes from?" Caravel shook her head. "It's because they don't just kill you," Zekthara said. "They make you disappear, not just your body, your whole ship, your whole fleet. One moment you're there, the next you're gone, and nobody can explain how." He took another drink. The alcohol seemed to loosen something inside him, some barrier he had built to keep the memories locked away. "You want to know about the war?" he asked. "You want to know why veterans like me drink ourselves to sleep every night? Why we wake up screaming names in languages we barely understand?" "Yes," Caravel whispered. Zekthara stared into his glass for a long time. The cantina grew quieter around them as other customers left for the night. Finally, he began to speak. "The first thing you need to understand about humans is that they don't think like us. When a Vorthan faces certain death, he fights with honor. Until the end. When a human faces certain death, he finds a way to take his enemies with him. And if he can't do that, he finds a way to make sure his death means something." Caravel's recording device captured every word, but she found herself leaning closer anyway. "I was part of the 3rd Battle Group when we besieged Kepler 442b. Zekthara continued. "It was early in the war. We still thought humans were just another primitive species that would surrender once they saw our superior firepower. The colony had maybe 50,000 people. We had them completely surrounded. Their orbital defenses were destroyed. Their communication arrays were down. They had nowhere to run." He paused to finish his drink, then gestured for another. The bartender, a 4-armed alien with green skin, brought it quickly and retreated without a word. "The human commander was Captain Jake Morrison." His ship was called the Liberty's Edge. It was maybe a quarter the size of our smallest destroyer, armed with primitive projectile weapons and basic energy shields. By all rights, he should have surrendered immediately. But he didn't, Caravel guessed. No, Zekthara said. He did something worse. He sent us a message. Do you know what it said? Caravel waited. It said, "You have 5 minutes to withdraw from this system. After that, we consider this an act of war." Zekthara's cybernetic eye flickered as he accessed the memory file. We laughed. We actually laughed. Here was this tiny ship with its handful of crew, threatening an entire battle group. What happened next? Morrison didn't wait for an answer. He opened fire immediately. Not at our ships, which would have been useless. He targeted the colony's fusion reactor. One shot, perfectly placed, and the whole power grid went down. In the confusion that followed, civilian transport ships started launching from hidden bays we didn't even know existed. Zekthara's voice grew quieter. That's when we realized we weren't fighting a military engagement. We were fighting an evacuation. Morrison was buying time for his people to escape, and he was willing to destroy his own home to do it. The children went first, he continued, then the elderly, then the sick. The healthy adults stayed behind to help with the evacuation. And through it all, Morrison's ship kept moving, always staying between us and the transports. Every time we tried to intercept the fleeing civilians, the Liberty's Edge would appear and force us to engage. Caravel found herself holding her breath. How many people escaped? All of them, Zekthara said. 50,000 civilians, loaded onto ships that should have held maybe 10,000. They were crammed into cargo holds and maintenance tunnels. Some of the smaller children were strapped to the outside of ships in emergency suits. It should have been impossible. And Captain Morrison? He was the last to leave. By then, most of his ship was damaged beyond repair. His engines were failing. His weapons were nearly depleted. But he had one last surprise for us. Zekthara's hand began to shake slightly. Even 3 years later, the memory was still too fresh. Morrison had his demolitions expert, Sergeant Rick Hayes, wire the entire colony with explosives. Not just the military installations, everything, the power plants, the water treatment facilities, the gravity generators, even the underground transit system. When we moved in for the final assault, thinking we could at least capture the infrastructure intact, Morrison triggered everything at once. The explosion was visible from orbit. It created a gravitational shockwave that pulled in 3 of our battleships. Over 40,000 Vorthan soldiers died in an instant. But the worst part, the part that still keeps me awake at night, was Morrison's final transmission. What did he say? Zekthara looked directly at Caravel with his remaining organic eye. He said, "This is what mercy looks like. Next time, we won't evacuate first." The cantina had grown completely quiet around them. Even the background music seemed to have stopped. "That was my introduction to human warfare," Zekthara said. "That was the moment I realized we weren't fighting soldiers. We were fighting people who would burn down everything they had ever built rather than let us take it. People who would sacrifice themselves without hesitation if it meant protecting someone they had never met." Caravel stared at her recording device, trying to process what she had just heard. But that was just one battle. How did that translate to winning an entire war? Zekthara smiled grimly. Oh, that was just the beginning. Morrison was just one. Captain, one ship. One crew. There were thousands more just like him scattered across human space. Each one more impossible than the last. He stood up slowly, his cybernetic arm whirring softly as it adjusted his balance. You want to know how humans won the war? Come back tomorrow night. I'll tell you about the Phantom Fleet and Captain Lisa Park. I'll tell you why our navigators still refuse to enter certain sectors of space. As Zekthara walked toward the exit, Caravel called after him. Why are you telling me this? Why now? The old veteran paused at the door. Because someone needs to understand what we faced out there. Someone needs to know that we didn't lose because we were weak or cowardly. We lost because we encountered something that shouldn't exist. A species that fights like demons but thinks like angels. He disappeared into the corridor beyond, leaving Caravel alone with her recording and the beginning of a story that would change everything she thought she knew about the war that had reshaped the galaxy. The next evening, Caravel arrived at the cantina early. She had spent the entire day thinking about Zikthara's story. The official war records mentioned the battle at Kepler 442b, but they called it a minor skirmish. They said nothing about 40,000 dead Vorthan soldiers or a colony that turned itself into a weapon. She chose the same table in the dark corner and waited. Other customers came and went, but she kept her eyes on the entrance. When Zekthara finally appeared, he looked older somehow. The weight of telling his stories seemed to be taking a toll on the old veteran. He sat down without greeting her and ordered his usual drink. The four-armed bartender brought it quickly, along with a second glass for Caravel. She had not asked for anything, but she accepted it gratefully. "You came back," Zekthara said. "It was not a question." "You knew I would," Caravel replied, activating her recording device. Zekthara nodded slowly. "Most people don't want to hear these stories. They prefer the sanitized version in the history books. The one where we simply decided to make peace." "But that's not what happened." "No." Zekthara took a long drink. "What happened was that we learned to fear the dark. We learned that humans could make entire fleets disappear without a trace. We learned why our ancestors used to tell stories about ghosts." He leaned back in his chair, his cybernetic eye glowing brighter as he accessed deeper memory files. "The second story I want to tell you happened 6 months after Kepler 442b. We had changed our tactics by then. No more direct assaults on defended positions. Instead, we decided to hunt down individual human ships and destroy them one by one." Caravel leaned forward, her recorder capturing every word. "The target was a single human cruiser called the Defiant. Dawn. Intelligence reported that it was carrying supplies to isolated human outposts. The ship was commanded by Captain Lisa Park, a former civilian pilot who had volunteered for military service when the war started." Zekthara's voice grew quieter, as if speaking too loudly might summon the ghosts he was describing. "Admiral Kexvar assembled a full hunting fleet. 200 ships, including battlecruisers, destroyers, and fast attack craft. Our best pilots, our newest weapons, our most advanced sensors. We were going to make an example of this one human ship. Show the galaxy what happened to those who opposed the Vorthan Empire." 200 ships against one, Caravel murmured. "That seems excessive." "We thought so too at first. But Admiral Kexvar had studied the reports from Kepler 442b. He knew that humans did not follow normal military logic. He wanted to be absolutely certain of victory." Zekthara paused to drink, his mechanical fingers drumming against the table. "We tracked the Defiant Dawn to the Crimson Nebula, a region of space filled with charged particles and quantum field fluctuations. It was the perfect trap. The nebula would block their sensors and communications. They would be blind and alone, with nowhere to run." "But something went wrong," Caravel guessed. "Everything went wrong." Zekthara's organic eyes stared into the distance, seeing things that were no longer there. "We entered the nebula in perfect formation. Our sensors immediately started malfunctioning, just as expected. But that was supposed to affect the humans too. They were using the same basic sensor technology we had developed centuries ago. What we didn't know was that Captain Park had a science officer named Dr. Kevin Barnes. He was a former university professor who specialized in quantum physics. While we saw the nebula as an obstacle, Barnes saw it as an opportunity." Caravel found herself holding her breath as Zekthara continued. "The first sign that something was wrong came when our lead destroyer, the Vengeance, reported contact with the human ship. They fired a full spread of plasma torpedoes at point-blank range. Direct hits, according to their targeting systems. The human ship should have been vaporized instantly. But it wasn't. For a moment it was. Our sensors showed the Defiant Dawn breaking apart, hull fragments spinning away into space. The destroyer captain reported a confirmed kill. Then, 30 seconds later, the human ship appeared behind us and destroyed the Vengeance with a single shot. Zekdara's cybernetic eye flickered rapidly as he accessed the combat records. We thought it was impossible. You cannot fake a direct hit from plasma torpedoes. You cannot fake hull fragments and debris. But somehow the humans had done exactly that. How? Dr. Barnes had discovered that the nebula's quantum fields could be manipulated. By synchronizing their engines with the quantum pulse frequency, they could phase shift their ship for short periods. Not enough to travel through space, but enough to become incorporeal for a few seconds. Caravel struggled to understand. Incorporeal? Like a ghost, Zekthara explained. Visible but not. Solid, the plasma torpedoes passed right through them. What we saw breaking apart was just quantum echoes, projections created by the phase-shifting process. But that would require incredible precision. The timing would have to be perfect. Humans are very good at impossible things, Zekthara said. Grimly, Captain Park and her crew had spent weeks studying the nebula before we arrived. They knew its patterns better than we knew our own ship systems. The real nightmare began when we realized we were not fighting one ship. Every time the Defiant Dawn phase shifted, it left behind a quantum echo that looked solid on our sensors. Within an hour, our instruments were tracking dozens of human ships, all moving in different directions. Zekthara's hand began to shake slightly as he recalled the memory. We started firing at everything. Battlecruisers launched full spreads of missiles at targets that turned out to be empty space. Destroyers collided with each other trying to intercept ships that were not really there. The confusion was complete. Meanwhile, the real Defiant Dawn was picking us apart one ship at a time. It would appear behind a Vorthan vessel, fire a precise shot into the engine core, then vanish again before we could return fire. No wasted ammunition, no missed shots. Every attack was perfectly calculated to disable rather than destroy. They were trying not to kill you? That was the most terrifying part, Zekthara admitted. They could have destroyed our entire fleet. Their weapons were targeted at engine systems and weapon arrays, not crew quarters or life support. They were deliberately keeping us alive while demonstrating that they could kill us whenever they chose. How many ships did you lose? Over 100 disabled or destroyed. The survivors still call it the Night of Phantom Fire. Ships burning in the darkness while ghost images danced around us like evil spirits. Zekthara finished his drink and immediately ordered another. The battle ended when Captain Park transmitted a message to our remaining ships. She gave us coordinates that led directly out of the nebula to safety. Her exact words were, "You're beaten, but you're not broken. Go home and tell your people what you've seen here. Tell them that humans fight differently." She let you escape? All of us. Every surviving ship was given safe passage out of the nebula. Admiral Kexvar spent 3 days in his quarters after that, refusing to speak to anyone. When he finally emerged, he submitted a report to High Command that was classified immediately. To this day, most Vorthans believe the Crimson Nebula incident was a navigation accident. Caravel stared at her recording device, trying to process the implications. But why would Captain Park let you go? You came to destroy her ship. That's the question that haunted us for months afterward, Zekthara replied. We were enemy soldiers. In enemy territory, we had orders to show no mercy. But the humans showed us mercy anyway, even after proving they didn't need to. Dr. Barnes transmitted a data package along with the escape coordinates. It contained detailed sensor readings of the nebula, including information about safe passage routes and areas to avoid. They were giving us scientific data that could save Vorthan lives in the future. But that doesn't make tactical sense, Caravel protested. Why help your enemies? Zekthara looked at her with his remaining organic eye. Because humans don't see enemies the way we do. They see people who are fighting them, yes, but still people. Still someone's son or daughter, someone's friend or lover. They can kill when they have to, but they prefer not to. They would rather prove their point and send you home to think about it. The data package included a personal message from Captain Park to Admiral Kexvar. She said, "We know you have families waiting for you. We know you're following orders, just like we are. This war doesn't have to be about hatred. It can be about understanding. What happened to Captain Park and the Defiant Dawn? They continued their supply missions for another year before the ship was finally lost in the Battle of New Kepler. But by then the damage was done. Word of the Phantom Fleet had spread throughout the Vorthan military. Our pilots started seeing human ships in every sensor ghost, every equipment malfunction. Zekthara stood up slowly, his cybernetic arm whirring as it supported his weight. The humans had done something we thought was impossible. They had made us afraid of empty space itself. They had turned our own technology against us and shown us mercy when they could have shown us death. "Will you tell me another story tomorrow?" Caravel asked. "Yes," Zekthara said, walking toward the exit. "Tomorrow I'll tell you about the Battle of Teranova and Commander Ben Carter. I'll tell you about the day a human chose to die rather than let innocent people suffer." The third night found Caravel waiting at the same corner table, but this time she was not alone with her thoughts. Word had somehow spread about her interviews with the old war veteran. 3 other journalists sat at nearby tables, their recording. Devices ready, Caravel felt annoyed but said nothing. These stories belonged to everyone now. When Zekthara entered the cantina, he noticed the additional audience immediately. His cybernetic eye scanned each face, cataloging them like potential threats. For a moment, Caravel thought he might leave. Instead, he walked directly to their usual table and sat down heavily. "More witnesses tonight," he observed, gesturing toward the other journalists. "I'm sorry," Caravel began, but Zekthara raised his remaining hand to stop her. "No, it's good. These stories should be heard by more than one person. They should be spread across the galaxy so people understand what really happened during the war." He ordered his drink and waited until the bartender was gone before speaking again. "Tonight's story is different from the others. It's not about clever tactics or impossible escapes. It's about choice. It's about what happens when a human decides that some things are worth dying for." The cantina grew quieter as other customers sensed the weight in Zekthara's voice. Even the background music seemed to fade. "The Battle of Teranova was supposed to be our greatest victory," Zekthara began. "Admiral Vextar had assembled the First Fleet, our most powerful battle group. 300 ships, including the flagship Dominator. Our orders were simple. Make an example of the colony that would convince other human worlds to surrender without fighting." Teranova was different from other targets we had attacked. It wasn't a military base or a manufacturing center. It was a farming world, home to 2 million civilian colonists. Most of them were families who had never seen combat. Children, elderly people, teachers, farmers, innocent people who just wanted to live in peace. Caravel noticed that Zekthara's voice carried a note of shame when he spoke about the civilians. Even now, years later, he seemed uncomfortable with the memory. The human defense was pathetic by our standards. One aging battleship called the Resilience, supported by maybe a dozen smaller vessels. The total human force was less than 50 ships. We outnumbered them 6-1, and our weapons were far superior. The human commander was Ben Carter, a career military officer who had served in their merchant fleet before the war started. His ship was over 30 years old, armed with outdated weapons and powered by systems that should have been scrapped years earlier. Any rational military leader would have surrendered immediately to save civilian lives. Zekthara paused to drink, his mechanical fingers tapping against the glass. But Carter wasn't rational. None of them were. When Admiral Vextar transmitted the demand for unconditional surrender, Carter's response was broadcast on all frequencies so everyone could hear it. "What did he say?" one of the other journalists asked. "He said, 'Admiral Vextar, you have come to our world with ships of war to threaten innocent people. I challenge you to single combat. My ship against yours. If you win, the colony surrenders. If I win, you withdraw from this system and never return." Several of the listeners gasped. Even Caravel, who had heard 2 nights of impossible human stories, found this hard to believe. "Admiral Vextar thought it was a joke," Zekthara continued. "The Dominator was 10 times the size of the Resilience. Our flagship carried weapons. That could crack planets. It had shields that could withstand the combined firepower of an entire enemy fleet. The idea that one obsolete human battleship could challenge it seemed like madness. But Admiral Vextar was also a proud warrior from an old family. He had been trained in the ancient traditions of honor combat. When Carter repeated the challenge formally, according to traditional protocols, Vextar felt bound to accept. The terms were simple. The two ships would fight alone, without support from other vessels. The battle would continue until one ship was destroyed or surrendered. All other ships would withdraw to a safe distance and observe without interfering. Vextar's cybernetic eye began to flicker more rapidly as he accessed the combat recordings. What happened next is something our military analysts still don't fully understand. Carter had spent months studying our tactics, our technology, our ship designs. He knew things about Vorthan military doctrine that we had forgotten ourselves. The Dominator's main weapon was a plasma cannon capable of destroying a city with a single shot. But Carter had discovered something in our own technical manuals that our own gunners didn't know. The weapon required a 30-second charging cycle between shots. During those 30 seconds, the ship's entire defensive grid would shut down to channel power to the main gun. But knowing that information and using it are different things, Caravel pointed out. How could he take advantage of a 30-second window when the first shot would destroy his ship? That's what made Carter's plan so impossible, Vextar replied. He positioned the Resilience directly in the Dominator's firing line, close, enough that our main gun couldn't miss. When Admiral Vextar fired, Carter should have died instantly along with his entire crew. Instead, at the exact moment the plasma cannon discharged, Carter activated his ship's emergency teleportation system. It was a one-use device designed to evacuate the crew in case of catastrophic damage, but Carter didn't use it to escape. The cantina had become completely silent. Even the bartender had stopped moving, listening to every word. Carter teleported his entire ship, including its overloading reactor core, directly into the Dominator's bridge during the weapon's charging cycle. Both ships were destroyed instantly, but the explosion created an electromagnetic pulse that disabled our entire fleet for several hours. He committed suicide, one of the journalists whispered. He and his crew of 800 volunteers, Vextar confirmed. 800 people who knew they were going to die but chose to do it anyway to protect 2 million civilians they had never met. But why? Caravel asked. Why not evacuate the civilians and retreat? Why not try to fight a conventional battle? Because Carter understood something that we didn't, Vextar replied. He knew that if Teranova fell, if 2 million innocent people were killed or enslaved, it would break something in the human spirit. It would prove to other colonies that resistance was hopeless. But if he could show that humans would die, rather than let innocents suffer, if he could prove that no price was too high to pay for protecting the defenseless, then other worlds would keep fighting. Other people would resist. Vextar's voice grew softer. Carter transmitted a message during the teleportation sequence. The last words anyone heard from the Resilience were, "This is how humans say goodbye. Remember that we chose this. Remember that some things are worth dying for." The electromagnetic pulse that destroyed both ships also disabled our troop transports and communications systems. By the time our fleet recovered, every civilian on Teranova had been evacuated to other systems. The colony was empty except for automated defenses that made occupation impossible. So you gained nothing, Caravel realized. Worse than nothing. We lost our flagship and our most experienced admiral. We lost 8 destroyer escorts that were caught in the explosion. And we lost something even more important. We lost the illusion that humans could be intimidated. Vextar finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. News of Carter's sacrifice spread throughout human space within days. Colonies that had been considering surrender suddenly found new resolve. Civilian populations began volunteering for military service in unprecedented numbers. Children started training with weapons instead of toys. But the real impact was on our own forces. Our soldiers began to whisper about the humans who would rather die than surrender. They started asking themselves what kind of enemy chooses death over defeat. What kind of people make that choice not just for themselves, but for complete strangers? The propaganda department tried to spin it as a terrorist attack, but our military commanders knew better. This wasn't terrorism. This was something far more dangerous. This was sacrifice with purpose. This was people who believed in something more important than their own lives. One of the other journalists leaned forward. How did your soldiers react to that knowledge? Fear, Zekthara said simply. Not fear of death, which every soldier understands. Fear of facing an enemy that doesn't fear death. Fear of fighting people who would rather destroy themselves than let you win. But there was something else too. Something our commanders didn't expect. Some of our soldiers began to feel respect. They started asking questions about what the humans were protecting. What made Teranova worth dying for? What made 2 million strangers worth 800 lives? Those questions were dangerous because they made us think about our own motivations. Why were we fighting this war? What were we trying to achieve? Were we protecting our own people, or were we just conquering because we could? Zekthara stood up slowly, his cybernetic arm supporting his weight. Carter's sacrifice changed the entire nature of the conflict. It stopped being a war of conquest and became a war of ideologies, our empire against their principles, our strength against their convictions. And principles can't be defeated with weapons, Caravel observed. The fourth night brought more than journalists to the cantina. Word of HFY Stories had spread throughout Nexus 7, and now the dark corner where he usually sat was surrounded by a small crowd. Vorthan veterans, human traders, alien, diplomats, and curious civilians all gathered to hear the old soldier's tales. Caravel arrived early to claim a seat near the front, but she worried that Zekthara might not show up with so many people present. When he finally entered the cantina, she saw him pause at the entrance, scanning the crowd with his cybernetic eye. For a moment, she thought he would turn and leave. Instead, he walked through the crowd to the center of the room. Someone had placed a chair there, and he sat down slowly. The bartender brought his usual drink without being asked, and the crowd fell silent. Tonight I tell you about the darkest day of the war, Zekthara began, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. It was the day we learned that humans can do terrible things for good reasons. It was the day our empire realized that we had created our own worst enemy. He took a long drink before continuing. The battle happened at a mining asteroid called Rock 7. It wasn't important strategically, but it was home to about 5,000 human workers and their families. Mostly civilians with only a small security force to protect them from pirates. Our intelligence report said the asteroid contained rare minerals needed for human weapon production. The plan was simple. Capture the facility intact, interrogate the workers about human supply lines, then use them as hostages to force other colonies to surrender. Zekthara's organic eye stared into the distance as he accessed the painful memories. Admiral Korthax led the assault with a medium-sized fleet. 50 ships, including his personal command vessel, the Iron Fist. The human defenders had maybe 10 security patrol boats, barely armed civilian craft. It should have been over in minutes. But the humans had a secret weapon we didn't know about. The facility commander was Captain Susan Blake, a former military engineer who had been assigned to civilian duty after being wounded in an earlier battle. She had lost her left leg and part of her right arm in that fight, but her mind was still sharp. What made Captain Blake dangerous was her background. Before the war, she had designed defensive systems for military installations. She knew how to turn ordinary equipment into weapons. She knew how to make a mining facility into a fortress. A human trader in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. What did she do? She turned the asteroid itself into a weapon, Zekthara replied. Rock 7 was a mining operation, which meant it was filled with explosives, heavy machinery, and industrial equipment. Blake had her people place charges throughout the facility, not to destroy it, but to create controlled collapses that would trap our soldiers in narrow tunnels. The mining lasers were reprogrammed to work as defensive weapons. The ore processing equipment was modified to create toxic gas clouds. Even the gravity generators were rigged to create zones where our soldiers would be crushed by their own. Wait, Zekthara paused to drink, his mechanical fingers drumming against the glass. But the real trap was psychological. Blake made sure our advance teams found evidence of the facility's defensive preparations. She wanted us to know that taking the asteroid would be difficult and costly. And then she made us an offer. She would surrender the facility and all its workers without a fight, but only if Admiral Korthax agreed to treat the civilians according to galactic warfare conventions. No interrogations, no hostages, no forced labor. Just simple imprisonment until the war ended. It seemed reasonable, one of the Vorthan veterans in the crowd said. Why didn't the Admiral accept? Because Admiral Korthax was an old-school military commander who believed that showing mercy was a sign of weakness. He had orders to extract information from the workers, and he intended to follow those orders regardless of the cost. He rejected Blake's offer and ordered a full assault on the facility. What happened next is something that still gives me nightmares. Zekthara's voice grew quieter, forcing the crowd to lean forward to hear him. The attack began at dawn, asteroid time. Our assault troops landed at multiple points and began advancing through the mining tunnels. Blake's defensive preparations worked exactly as designed. Every corridor became a killing ground. Every intersection was a trap. But our soldiers were well-trained and experienced. They adapted to the defensive tactics and began making progress toward the facility's core. Within 6 hours, we had captured about half the asteroid and were closing in on the civilian shelters. That's when Captain Blake activated her final defense. She had rigged the asteroid's fusion reactors to overload in a specific sequence. Not a simple explosion that would destroy everything instantly, but a cascade failure that would give our soldiers exactly 30 minutes to evacuate before the asteroid broke apart. 30 minutes? Caravel asked. Why 30 minutes? Because that was how long Blake calculated it would take for our transport ships to dock and evacuate our assault troops. She was giving us time to save our own people while sacrificing herself and all the civilians under her protection. The crowd stirred uneasily. This was not the kind of military tactic they expected to hear about. Blake transmitted the evacuation. Warning on all frequencies, along with detailed instructions for reaching the docking bays safely. She even provided maps showing which routes were still clear of her defensive traps. Then she locked herself and all the civilian workers in the facility's core, where the reactor overload would kill them first. But why? A young Vorthan asked. Why kill the civilians? Why not just evacuate them too? Because Blake understood something about Admiral Korthax that we didn't realize at the time. She knew he would rather let his own soldiers die than retreat empty-handed. If she just destroyed the facility, he would send more troops to die trying to recover something from the wreckage. But if she made it clear that staying meant watching 5,000 innocent people die for no reason, she was betting that even. Korthax wouldn't be able to justify that to his conscience. Zekthara's cybernetic eye flickered rapidly as he accessed the combat recordings. The next 29 minutes were the longest of my military career. I was part of the evacuation team, helping our wounded soldiers reach the transport ships. But the whole time, we could hear Blake's voice on the communication channels. She was talking to the civilian workers, keeping them calm. She read stories to the children. She helped families record final messages to relatives on other worlds. She organized the adults into work groups to maintain life support systems. Until the very end. And she kept transmitting updates to our fleet. Reactor status, countdown timers, evacuation progress reports. She was helping us save our people while she waited to die with hers. The cantina had become completely silent except for Zekthara's voice and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. With 2 minutes left on the countdown, Admiral Korthax finally ordered the retreat. Our last transport ship undocked. Just as the cascade failure reached critical point, from our ship's viewports we watched Rock 7 break apart like a flower opening in slow motion. 5,000 human civilians died in those explosions. Captain Blake died with them. And every single one of our assault troops survived because a human commander chose to sacrifice innocent lives to save enemy soldiers. But that doesn't make sense, someone in the crowd protested. Why save your enemies? Because Blake understood. The real war we were fighting, Zekthara explained. It wasn't about territory or resources or even survival. It was about what kind of people we choose to be when everything is at stake. Blake's final transmission was broadcast throughout both fleets. She said, "Admiral Korthax, you came here to capture innocent people and use them as weapons. I'm showing you what that really means. I'm showing you what happens when someone chooses to sacrifice innocence for military advantage. Look at what your orders have made me do. Look at what your war has turned me into." Then she said, "These people are dying because you wouldn't accept an honorable surrender. Their blood is on your hands, not mine. But their sacrifice will save your soldiers because that's what humans do. We protect life, even when it belongs to our enemies." Zekthara stood up slowly, his artificial arm whirring as it supported his weight. Admiral Korthax spent the rest of the war in a medical facility, being treated for what our doctors called acute stress reaction, but I was there. I saw what really happened to him. He broke, completely and totally. The sight of 5,000 people choosing to die rather than be used as weapons destroyed something inside him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function as a military commander, because Blake had shown him the logical conclusion of his own tactics. She had made him watch innocent people die for military objectives, and then she had made him realize that he was responsible for their deaths. But she also saved his soldiers, every one of them. And that contradiction, that impossible combination of terrible sacrifice and profound mercy, was something his mind couldn't process. The battle at Rock 7 was officially classified as a minor tactical victory. The report said we had destroyed a human weapons facility and eliminated enemy personnel, but every soldier who was there knew the truth. The fifth night brought the largest crowd yet to the cantina. Word had spread throughout the station and beyond. Reporters from major news networks had arrived from distant systems. Military officers from a dozen different species sat alongside civilians and traders. Even the station commander had come to hear the final story. Caravel found herself squeezed into a corner as more and more people packed into the room. When Zekthara arrived, he had to push through the crowd to reach the center chair that had become his unofficial speaking platform. Someone had set up amplification equipment so everyone could hear clearly. The old veteran sat down and looked around the room with his remaining organic eye. His cybernetic eye was scanning faces, recording everything for his personal memory files. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had been building through 4 nights of terrible stories. "Tonight I tell you how the war ended," he began. "Not with a great battle or a heroic last stand, but with 12 people on a small ship who changed everything we thought we knew about victory and defeat." He paused as the bartender brought his drink. The crowd waited in complete silence. It happened 6 months after the disaster at Rock 7. Our military high command was in chaos. Too many admirals had suffered breakdowns after facing human tactics. Too many soldiers were asking questions about the nature of the war we were fighting. Morale was at its lowest point in the Empire's history. That's when a single human ship arrived at our home system. Not a battleship or a carrier, but a small diplomatic vessel called the Olive Branch. It carried no weapons, no armor, no defensive systems. Just 12 humans led by someone called Ambassador Helen Woods. A murmur ran through the crowd. Most of them had heard of the Treaty of New Geneva, but few knew the details of how it had been negotiated. The ship's arrival caused panic in our high command. After years of fighting humans who turned everything into weapons, the sudden appearance of an unarmed vessel in our most heavily defended system seemed impossible. Our admirals were convinced it was some kind of trap. Security forces surrounded the Olive Branch with hundreds of warships. We demanded explanations, threatened destruction, ordered immediate surrender. But Ambassador Woods simply requested permission to address the Vorthan Council directly. She said she had a story to tell us. Zekthara took a long drink before continuing. I was part of the security detail assigned to escort Ambassador Woods to the council chambers. She was a small woman, maybe 50 years old, with gray hair and kind eyes. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a military leader or a politician. She carried only a small data pad and wore simple civilian clothes. No bodyguards, no weapons, no defensive equipment. She walked into the most heavily fortified building on our homeworld, as if she were visiting friends for dinner. The council chamber was filled with our greatest military leaders and most powerful politicians. These were people who commanded star fleets and ruled entire sectors of space. But when Ambassador Woods began to speak, they listened like children. Hearing their first bedtime story, the crowd leaned forward as Zekthara's voice grew softer. She told us about human history. Not the military victories or technological achievements that we had studied, but the darker chapters that humans try not to remember. She told us about wars that killed millions of people, about weapons that could destroy entire cities, about hatred so deep that neighbors turned against neighbors. She showed us records of human conflicts that made our war look small by comparison. Genocides, slavery, oppression, cruelty beyond imagination. She made us understand that every tactic we had faced, every impossible strategy that had confused our generals, was something humans had first used against each other. But then she told us something else. She told us how humans had learned to move beyond those dark chapters, how they had built laws to protect the innocent, how they had created institutions to prevent future conflicts, how they had learned to channel their capacity for destruction into protection of the defenseless. Zekthara's cybernetic eye flickered as he accessed the memory files of that historic meeting. Ambassador Woods explained that humans weren't naturally peaceful. They weren't born knowing right from wrong. Every principle they fought for, every value they protected, had been earned through centuries of mistakes and suffering. They had learned to be better than their instincts because they had seen what happened when they weren't. She showed us Captain Morrison, who destroyed a city to save its people. She showed us Captain Park, who could have destroyed our fleet, but chose mercy instead. She showed us Commander Carter, who died rather than let innocents suffer. She showed us Captain Blake, who made the ultimate sacrifice to protect enemy soldiers. And then she asked us a question that changed everything. She said, "You've seen what humans can do when we're your enemies. Imagine what we could accomplish as your allies." The crowd stirred as they began to understand the implications of that question. The council members tried to argue. They pointed out our superior technology, our larger fleets, our greater experience in warfare. They insisted that the Vorthan Empire was still the stronger force and could win the war if necessary. Ambassador Woods didn't disagree. She simply asked another question: what would victory look like? Would you occupy our worlds and govern 2 billion humans who have proven they would rather die than submit? Would you imprison families whose children have been taught that some things are worth any sacrifice? Would you rule over people who see enemy soldiers as individuals deserving of mercy? She made us realize that conquering humanity would be like trying to hold water in our hands. The harder we squeezed, the more they would slip away. And every attempt to control them would require us to become the kind of people we had sworn never to be. Zekthara stood up slowly, his artificial arm supporting his weight as he addressed the packed room. But the most powerful moment came when Ambassador Woods made her final offer. Instead of demanding reparations or territory, she proposed a partnership. Human engineers would help repair the damage caused by the war. Vorthan scientists would share their knowledge to help humanity develop better defensive technologies. She offered to turn our enemies into our teachers and our students. She offered to transform a war of destruction into a collaboration of creation. The Council voted unanimously to accept her proposal 3 days later. The Treaty of New Geneva was signed by representatives of both species, establishing the framework for cooperation that continues today. But the real victory wasn't in the treaty terms or the formal agreements. It was in the understanding that Ambassador Woods had created. She had shown us that the most terrifying thing about humans wasn't their capacity for destruction. It was their capacity for forgiveness. The crowd remained silent as Zekthara gathered his thoughts for the final part of his story. 6 months. After the treaty was signed, I received an assignment that would have been impossible during the war. I was posted to a joint research station in neutral space, working alongside human scientists and engineers. My first partner was Dr. Rachel Stone, a former military officer who had lost her brother in the Battle of Teranova. I expected hatred, suspicion, maybe fear. Instead, she greeted me with curiosity and respect. She wanted to understand Vorthan. Military tactics not to defeat them, but to learn from them. She wanted to combine our strategic thinking with human innovation to create better defensive systems. Over the months that followed, we developed technologies that neither species could have created alone. Defensive shields that used Vorthan. Engineering with human adaptability. Communication systems that combined our reliability with their creativity. Weapons designed not to destroy, but to disable and protect. But more importantly, we developed something else. We developed friendship. Dr. Stone taught me about human culture, their music, their literature, their dreams for the future. I taught her about Vorthan history, our traditions, our hopes for peace. And slowly I began to understand what Ambassador Woods had really accomplished. She hadn't just ended a war. She had shown two species how to see each other as people, instead of enemies. Zekthara looked around the room one final time, his gaze settling on each face in the crowd. That's why I'm here on Nexus 7, not as a refugee or exile, but as part of the first generation to learn that former enemies can become the closest allies. I work now with humans and Vorthans and dozens of other species to protect neutral space from pirates and raiders. We explore dangerous frontiers together. We face unknown threats as partners. We've learned that the universe is too vast and too dangerous for any species to face alone. The Human-Vorthan War taught us that the greatest strength isn't the ability to destroy your enemies. It's the wisdom to turn your enemies into friends. It's the courage to offer mercy when you could demand vengeance. It's the faith to believe that even the bitterest conflicts can end in understanding. As Zekthara walked toward the exit, the crowd began to disperse slowly. People talked quietly among themselves, processing the implications of what they had heard. The stories that had begun as tales of military conflict had become something much more important. Caravel remained in her corner, staring at her recording device.